also wrote about the diversity, and on page 137, you say, as we study the incarnational rhythms of Jesus, we discover that he loves bringing opposites together, reconciling differences. The interesting thing is, for me personally, my perception of some of the churches in South Africa. I used to be a pastor of a multicultural church in the west of Johannesburg. And I can remember I used to reflect and look at the other churches around me. And it was almost as if some of those churches, not all of it, it was the last place where some people could be white, Afrikaans, and they can still do their religion in their language. Where it was quite funny because our church started off white and Afrikaans, and we ended up with a very multicultural, very mixed English church in the community. What do we look at when we speak about God bringing diversity together? Because we've got a lot of people today, they are rather motivated by, you look the same as I do, and we've got this underlying fear of the other. How do we cross that as apprentices of Jesus?
Yeah, let me first of all say that it's really hard.
Yeah.
I think if we think of the disciples themselves, it's not a task that you can go into without the empowerment of the Spirit.
Amen.
So being empowered to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the world is a massive task of crossing differences. I think those first followers were like the Samaritans. I mean,
Yeah, who are they?
we used to call them dogs. You know? Now you want us to be with them, you know. Our country, with its huge divisions, I think has a massive still battle with integration. So I think the diversity is socioeconomic, it's race. You know, I think in this last week, in the South African narrative, where it has become so apparent again how threatened women are, you know, it's reconciling men and women.
Yeah, for sure.
The elder and children, you know, so I think the dream of God is massive. Dallas Willard has this beautiful phrase where he says the aim of God in history is to create an all-inclusive community of love with God in its center as its most glorious inhabitant and sustainer.
Sure.
And I think the challenge is that to live into that is not a strategy that you can blueprint. It's following relationships.
Absolutely.
And it's slow work. I tell the story in Raw Spirituality. We, you know, had to grapple with how to become inclusive with language. You mentioned it, and the moment you talk about language, you're in identity issues, and you know, people sometimes use the church actually as a cave for ethnicity.
Yeah, for sure.
Instead of discipleship. And it shouldn't surprise us if you read the text. I see there's a whole commentary on Acts. You know, the Acts 6 fight is about the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews, you know, so there's very early in the narrative all these tensions. And I think, you know, for communities to learn how to be hospitable is probably one of the major things. I'm following my mission at this moment, going back into the Dutch Reformed Church, the NG Kerk, which is an Afrikaans church. And this Sunday, I was so thankful. We hosted the University of Johannesburg's choir, and our whole service was in English. And I said to my colleagues yesterday, the fact that we didn't get one phone call saying, "Hey, I couldn't worship my God in my language today," is
it's the best news ever.
It is so helpful. And I think, you know, obviously with our identities. You know, Christ loves the Afrikaner and the Sotho and the Xhosa and the Zulu and the English. But I think the church is being challenged how to partner, how to, you know, follow God's mission together. And for us as South Africans, it's a tough nut to crack still.
Yeah, for sure.
Martin Luther King Jr. used to say that, you know, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning in America used to be the most segregated hour. I think in South Africa, unfortunately, a lot of times that is still the case.
Mm.
I think if you widen the lens a little bit and think of God's church not just as a community that meets on a Sunday for an hour, there's a lot of integration that is starting to happen.
Absolutely.
But I think our generation, and I mean, we're talking to each other as two white males, I think if we shrink South Africa to a town of 100 people, we are 7 out of that 100. So I always say in Afrikaans to people, ons gaan moet leer hoe om saam met die ander maatjies te speel.
Yeah, for sure.
God has many playmates, and so difference becomes part of this. I think learning the habits of listening, not being arrogant.
Yeah.
We live unfortunately in the shadow of centuries of colonialism.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think it invites us into different reflexes and postures. So, yeah.
On page 163, you said something that is really incredible, and I think it just adds on to what you've just spoken of. You say that we are all part of God's mission. All Christians are in full-time ministry, and you've just stated that beautifully. But I want to focus on that first part. We are all part of God's mission. In a way, I think in the past sense, missionaries came to Africa and in a way thought that teaching people to eat with a knife and fork, you are salvaging people and saving them from themselves. Where the church now, in Africa, the challenge is to enter those wild spaces that you mentioned in the book. And I think there's a lot of pastors that are sitting in their churches and they don't know how to take the first step. Can you maybe give a indication as to what would be a good first step when we reach out to these other greater communities within our context? And this is for both black and white pastors. I know of black pastors that are scared to go to another church or a different setting and to really reach out to those communities. So what would you suggest?
I mean, these are just suggestions, definitely. Let me go back to the research I wanted to mention earlier. In research in the missional church in the last decade, they have found that when communities talk about the activity of God, God is only mentioned 5% of the times as the active operative of verbs in their community.
That's incredible.
So one of the things that is helpful in the missional church is something I already mentioned, is to move conversations away from church questions primarily to God questions.
Yeah, very good.
What is God up to? How can we join God's promised and preferred future in this community? I think that becomes a process that opens up journeys of discernment. So instead of blueprinting what we are bringing into this community, is to follow the clues of what God is doing. I think Luke 10 is a beautiful example of this, how Jesus sends his disciples into the community. He tells them to allow the community to be hospitable towards them, to find the people of peace. So I think, for churches, I would say slowly, shift the questions and then start these discernment journeys where we learn how to be in other people's shoes, to meet God in the other. I think go and learn what is happening in your community.
Yeah, for sure.
Some churches operate as if the community equals their church building.
Yeah, very good.
And that's the idea of the parish. But, start to see where join in partnership with God in the neighborhood. And then we discover that we're not alone.
Exactly.
Sometimes we think we're like Elijah. We're running away like, God, there's no one.
Absolutely.
And then the Lord's like, listen, I have a gang of 7,000 that's working on this. So partnerships, I think, becomes really, really important. That you mentioned this earlier, that the mission is not to trademark people to our denomination or to our local church, but to allow people to join in God's kingdom.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of people insecure.
Exactly, because you are expending energy that might not reflect back onto people tithing in your church or bums on seats.
Yeah.
So there's a dying that needs to take place.
Sure.
But yeah, I think those two things are massive. Maybe just the third thing, I think there's a huge challenge in terms of our core message. What is our core message?
Very good.
I think a lot of pastors can't really reflect holistically on the question, what is the gospel?
Amen.
And I see this. I have the opportunity to work with quite a few denominations, and I'll just tell one story. The other day I asked a group of almost 200 ministers, if a congregant should ask you what is the gospel, what would your answer be? And they round-tabled it and had a 20-minute conversation, and we did feedback. Beautiful answers, ranging from love to the cross to the resurrection but the word kingdom was never there. So I said, well, if we think through how Jesus summarized, it was the good news of the availability of the kingdom. So I said, I'm just struck by the omission. And then one pastor put up his hand and he said, yeah, but it's implied. The kingdom is implied. So
Sure.
I asked him, so how do your congregants know this? And he said, well, in 1996, I did a 3-week sermon series on the kingdom. So everybody started laughing, just like you. So I think, those discovering God as the active partner, our community, and then really reflecting on, so what is the gospel? So, yeah.
Yeah, that is key.